And so now we're at this point where we finally have an answer as to what's going on with him. I think that was the moment that I realized how not only how in pain he was, but how big of an issue this had all become.
While we're sitting in that ER, he's starting to have withdrawal symptoms. His hand was shaking so bad that he almost couldn't get, like, the water was, like, spilling everywhere. And so it was, like, really difficult to see him like that.
He was a guy who never cried, who never broke, who never really showed much weakness in general. He just looked so beaten down.
I don't know if I can handle this. And I felt really bad feeling that way, but I was like, I don't know if I can do this. Hey, how's it going?
It's going. So last episode, we kinda got into the meat of it, in terms of everything that happened with my dad and kind of the behind the scenes stuff before he died, what we were dealing with as a family. We talked about his kind of slip into um, alcohol addiction, like full blown addiction, and what that looked like. And most of that story, most of that is us piecing together various bits of information that we got over almost a year long period. And even after he died, we still were learning a little bit more about that period of his life, of our lives, I would say, because it's not like he was the most forthcoming about all of that during that time. So again, hindsight being 2020, we know a lot more about what was happening now than we did in the moment. But
We were kind of just dealing with the shock and the trauma. I don't know, trauma, I guess, but it is traumatic to like find out somebody that you care about is struggling with something. And that's like a big struggle. So it's very,
when also he had been dealing with that stuff for much longer than we had known about. Like we had just found out about it, and he had really been dealing with it on his own for months and months. And like we knew something was wrong, but we didn't really know what exactly it was. Um, and so now we're at this point where we finally have an answer as to what's going on with him. We finally have an answer as to why everything seems to be falling apart in his, with his mental health and in our family life and everything. So now we can finally do something about it. And you knew, as we kind of talked about, that he needed to go to detox to start with. It's not an end all be all, as we ended the episode on last. It's just the first step, but you knew that that was the first step, luckily. And so let's start there. So we kind of in progression of the story found out that he had this problem. We I went upstairs, we talked about it, and you uh said we needed to take him to detox. So I remember that night when we went to the hospital, and we're waiting for hours and hours and hours, and nothing was moving. Um, why don't you talk about it a little bit?
yeah, sure. I mean, obviously, we mentioned in the last episode that like when your dad finally caved in, I guess, and told you what was going on, he was very adamant about not telling me because, again, he was in this mindset of I can fix it myself. And as we mentioned in pretty detailed depth, like you cannot manage this type of thing by yourself. Um, Not only just because addiction in general needs an entire support system, but also because alcohol is dangerous when you're withdrawing from it. So I think that he wasn't happy going to the hospital. Obviously, you have to go to the hospital first in order to get admitted. Well, that's not true. You can go straight to detox. But a lot of times those places have like a long waiting list or you have to try to coordinate it on your own. And when you're in the middle of struggling with something like that, it's not like the thing that you want to be working on, right? So going to the ER made the most sense because I knew that there would be resources available to us. So even if he wasn't able to get in detox from the ER, that we would at least have the resources to know like what to do next, right? Um and he didn't want to go. But I do think that he realized that he had no leg to stand on, so to say. Um this was not something that he could fight, like especially with me, as stubborn as he
Yeah,
was.
everything was out in the open finally, um, and that meant that he no longer could make the claim that he could fix it on his own because obviously it had come to a head to where he very clearly
Mhm.
couldn't. And as much as he didn't want to go through this whole process, I think on some subconscious level he realized that he needed to, and he realized that like
Mhm.
fighting us was only going to make his life more difficult rather than easier. And on some level he wanted to get better, like he knew something was wrong. He obviously was very unhappy, and depressed, and I don't think he wanted to feel that way, um
Right.
but he still had this, he still was in this, in the middle of the addiction brain as well, of this means that I'm going to have to give up something that, quite frankly, as twisted as it is, I love, being alcohol.
Mhm.
And that's kind of that, where full-blown addiction, morphs your brain and or warps your mind, because you do
Yeah.
get into that state of, this has become the most important thing in my mind, both, or in my life, both physically and mentally, because it's the only thing that keeps me going. And then you start to not be, you're unable to imagine a life without it.
Yeah. Which we covered, in the last episode a bit too. And I think so. Again, going back to like him going into the hospital, obviously, as you mentioned, I working in a hospital on a cardiac floor, literally having alcohol withdrawal patients because they need cardiac monitoring. I understood how incredibly dangerous alcohol withdrawal was. And I think that, being perfectly honest, given the state that we were at and how bad it had gotten, if I think your dad knew this too, that if he became stubborn and absolutely refused, so I do think deep down he wanted to get the help because again, we've already said like Eric didn't do anything he didn't want to do. But I also think that he also recognized that it would it was like a non-negotiable. Like I wasn't gonna enable like that behavior, you know what I mean? Because he did need to get help and already I'd been such a huge advocate for taking care of your mental health. So like I think he also just knew that he wasn't gonna be able to like refuse this and not have maybe some not so great consequences as a result. So that night that you found out we went to the I was thinking like big hospital, they probably see a lot of this, they'll have lots of resources and unfortunately it was not the right place to take him to. We went to a very busy hospital, an emergency room, and then because there was again some stigma around alcohol withdrawal and just alcohol in general. I get it now working in the ER because we do get a lot of really intoxicated people who are homeless or have something else going on.
Who
They're just
also,
looking for a bed,
yeah, who also have no desire to actually do anything about it. They just,
get better.
yeah,
Mhm.
a lot, in the ER we
And
get a lot of people who come in intoxicated, whether it's from police picking them up or a paramedic picking them up, or they're homeless and just looking for a bed to sleep on
mhm.
because it's cold outside or whatever. And
Mhm.
they come into the ER because they're too intoxicated to take care of themselves. So we end up essentially being
Mhm.
their babysitter and making sure that they don't, vomit in their sleep or
That they're
whatever, that they're
safe.
safe. And
Yeah.
then, morning comes, or they sober up enough to where they can take care of themselves again, and we offer
Mhm.
detox, or that we offer them resources to hopefully try to stop this behavior and fix their lives. And I would say probably 80 to 90% of the time, people are just like, nope, I want to go home. And then they go and they will
And then
drink
they
more.
do it all over
And
again,
unfortunately, like,
and they come back to the
right.
ER.
And unfortunately, that's their right. Like, alcohol is legal. We can't stop you from doing it. It's not like, we
Mhm.
can't force you to go to detox. We can't force you to go to those places and get better. And so now there's
Mhm.
even, I've worked with doctors in the past who have this mentality of like, get them out of here before they start to withdraw, because then we have to admit them. So if they're not going to go to detox, if they want to keep drinking and ruining their life, and that's their decision,
Mhm.
um, well, at least get them out of the ER so that they're not wasting, or not, I shouldn't say wasting, but they're not using up a bed upstairs when they're just going to go and drink again anyway. And there's nothing we can do about it. Um, and I think
Yeah.
that that's an
And I think
unfortunate,
it ve
I think that's an unfortunate failure of our medical system as well,
Mhm.
because we see that stuff so often, and because of the laws in place and the way that things work, and just in society, and um, you can't force people to help themselves, and so utilizing resources to help somebody who doesn't want to be helped ultimately ends up fruitless.
Yeah, and it takes away from people who actually need those
Right.
resources. And so unfortunately, as a result of that, there is a bias that gets built up,
Hmm.
right? So, and again, we went to really big, busy level one trauma center. Hindsight, probably not the best place to bring him. They were extremely busy, as most trauma centers are, and in the grand scheme of things, Eric was just another intoxicated person. It wasn't anything urgent. And it was scary for us, but it wasn't anything
until
urgent in terms
he's
of a
until he's at the point of withdrawal where they're
actively
yeah until he's
withdrawing.
at the point of
Hmm.
withdrawing where they're worried about him seizing or going into cardiac arrest or something. Like, it's
Yeah,
something that's not quote unquote an emergency compared to other things. And like, when you triage in a hospital,
right,
you have to compare who needs to be seen first and who can wait. And he happened to be one of the people who could wait quite a while before he
right.
needed to be seen.
And so if you think about, so we sat there, and it's you, me, and your dad, and you think about the fact that, like, when you first started talking to him and he admitted this, he was intoxicated at the time, because that was what
Triggered the
led you to
conversation in the
question
first
him in the
place.
first
Yeah.
place. Right. But we sat at that ER for 6
In the
hours,
lobby.
and it was still packed
In
in the waiting room. Yep. And it was packed, and you could see in your dad that he was at the point that if he wasn't drinking every couple hours, he was starting to have withdrawal symptoms, because as that time went on further, not only from like the time he left the house, because obviously once he admitted that, and we knew what was going on, it's not like he was going to go get another drink in
yeah,
front of us,
no.
right? um and
Or
so
be able to sneak off
he
without us
agrees.
knowing what he's doing finally.
Exactly. And so he knows that this is, obviously he has to get the help, and unfortunately, you know because he probably was drinking so much and so often, while we're sitting in that ER, he's starting to have withdrawal symptoms. Not anything bad, very mild symptoms, but he was starting to get more irritable. And I get it. Like, he probably was embarrassed. He maybe realized he needed the help, but didn't necessarily really want to be there. And he's starting to get that, like, anxious feeling that comes with withdrawal, and, feeling uncomfortable and things like that. So I remember we're sitting there, and, like, we keep asking the charge nurse, like, and I explained it with him. It's obviously they have to talk to him, but, like, when we talked to the triage, when we talked to them, we just said, like, he needs detox. So Anyway, it got to the point where he was getting so irritable about it that I was just like, and honestly, I was getting tired of waiting too. And like the waiting room was not clearing out. Like for every person that went back, it filled right back up again. So I'm just like, we're not going to get in for a long time. And it had already been 6 hours. So given all of that consideration, and the fact that he was getting crankier by the minute, I said, this probably wasn't the right place for us to go. I'm okay with us going home right now because I think all of us are tired of waiting here. But the condition to that is that right away in the morning when we get up, we are going to a different hospital. And we're going to get you into detox. And so he agreed to that because he just didn't want to be in that waiting room
And he didn't
anymore.
really ultimately have a choice.
Right. Not without consequences
Not
anyways. Everybody has a choice with
right.
everything, but
Well, he
yeah.
knew, yeah, ultimately with us, if he wanted to
Yeah.
have, you know, if he wanted to redeem himself with us, he didn't have a choice.
Right, exactly. So, uh I'm sure that we talked that night a little bit. I don't know that we talked about anything deep because obviously he was still very emotionally cut off. Part of it probably was at that point the fact that he had, you know, his brain
Hmm.
was affected by like he was emotionally stunted as a result of like drinking
I
so
think,
much at that moment in
I think,
time. And then also he just still I think he was just
oh,
embarrassed,
yeah.
like he didn't want to talk
Oh, yeah.
about it.
I think, I remember, I think this was right after, like before we actually got him into detox, but when we got home that night, I'm pretty sure that's when this happened. But I remember getting home and it was dark out and we were all kind of standing in the kitchen and,
Mhm.
and he, I was standing off to the side and we were all kind of just like exhausted from the day or from the night. Cause like that
Mhm.
conversation that we had that started this was at like 9 o'clock at night. Like it wasn't early on in the day. It was already dark out by the
No.
time we went to the hospital. And so by this point, it was probably like 3 or 4 in the morning that we were getting
Yeah.
home from the hospital, having accomplished basically nothing, um, coming
Mhm.
up with this deal. But I think this was kind of the moment that it all really set in for all of us what was happening and like what was gonna what our lives were gonna look like for the
Mhm.
next while as we tried to resolve this as a family. I remember being very distraught because I kind of realized, like, being a 17-year-old, when I first had that conversation with my dad, I didn't realize the seriousness of what was going on. I remember him saying, like, I just don't want to, when we had that conversation, like, I don't want to have to, I don't want to have to, you know, not be able to ever have a drink again. And my first inclination was like, oh, as long as we can get it under control, I don't think that'll be a problem. Now I look back and I realize at the level of addiction he was at, sobriety is pretty much the only option without him slipping back into
Mhm.
that because of how it has warped his mind with an inclination towards alcohol. At least sobriety for a very long time, if not forever. I don't think that,
Mhm.
knowing what I know about addiction now, it's very extremely rare that somebody can be to that point of addiction and then take a break from alcohol and then be able to come back and enjoy it in a healthy manner. That's so incredibly rare that it's almost 100% you need sobriety at that point. I didn't know that at
Mhm.
that point, so I was like, oh, it was a bit naive of me. Um, but it was at that moment that I really
Well,
kind
and
of
and why would you know
right.
why would you know that?
But I remember we got back and we were all standing in the kitchen, and I remember very vividly, he kind of broke down crying in your arms, um, because I think
Mhm.
not only was he embarrassed, but he was sad that his life had gotten to this point. Like he's sad that he let himself get to this point. And so I think,
And we were all really sad
yeah,
as
and so
well.
that was kind of the moment I think for me that I realized how much in pain he really was. And then of course,
Mhm.
seeing my dad, the strongest person I've ever known, like one of the strongest people I've ever known, one of the most amazing father I could have asked for, someone that I was so incredibly close to, be in such a weak and vulnerable state, like hit me really hard. And I remember you saying something
Mhm.
along the lines of like, "Hey, you know, your son's having a hard time over there. You should go, you know, comfort him
Yeah.
and let him know that you're gonna try your best to fix this and get better as a family." And that was
Mhm.
a really difficult moment, I think, for all of us. But that was kind of the moment for me that I think that's why it stands out. Because earlier you and I were kind of talking about this in preparation for this episode, and you're like, you said like, I don't really know if I remember that moment, but I think it stands out for me
Yeah, I
because
do now as you talk about
yeah, I
it.
think it stands out for me in that time period as a very specific moment because I think that was the moment that I realized how not only how in pain he was, but how big of an issue this had all become within our family
Mhm.
and started to realize this is going to affect all of our lives for a very long time from here on out. You know,
Yeah. It's gonna change a lot of things.
it's going to be a journey basically.
Well, and, you know, unfortunately, the nature of any sort of substance use disorder is it involves a lot of lying and a lot of breaking of trust. So it was recognizing not only obviously that he was in that much pain, which was really hard to see, but also I know for me in the back of my mind, it was like realizing like this is going to be one long journey.
Well, and I think, on that same point, that was something that I kind of started to wrap my brain around too is this person that my entire life we've had this very strong connection and open communication as a family and all this stuff. This person has been lying to us for almost half a year, if not even a little longer.
Mhm.
Lying to our faces.
And doing it really
Yeah,
well.
and like doing it to the point where again, even then, I was a bit more naive than I am now, being 17, but I still wasn't stupid. Like I could tell that something was wrong,
Mhm.
and and you especially are not a naive person either. Like it's
Mm-mm.
not like I would say generally, both of us are fairly emotionally intelligent. Both of us are very good at with intuition and picking up on people's subtle tells. And he
Mhm.
was extremely good at hiding what was actually going on and playing on all of our kind of misperceptions about things or our trust, because that was
Mhm.
the other thing is he definitely played on the fact that he knew we trusted him to hide what he was doing.
Mhm.
um
Yeah.
and
And I
so
and I
that
think it just goes to
realization was
oh.
also you know a scary thing to think about of like he has the capability to lie
Yeah.
to us on that level.
Well, and it's a sense of betrayal
Right.
because he hadn't done that up until that point. And I think it just goes to show how much this type of stuff really hijacks your brain and changes who you are when it when you're doing it so chronically like that
Well, and that was the whole
or
reason
so much.
that was the whole reason why that the conversation started out with me saying, "You are
Mhm.
not my dad when you act like this." And I didn't even know that it was
Mhm.
alcohol. But that's
Yeah.
exactly what it was, is he did not act like the same person when he was under that influence. And I
Yeah.
again,
And he wasn't thinking like he normally did
oh
because
yeah.
again, it literally takes over your brain and how you deal with things and how you
Mhm.
justify things and how you think about things and
Right.
all of that. It's a
S-
it's a
So that next morning, I was gonna try to bridge into the next thing, but I
oh
didn't
yeah.
mean to interrupt you.
I was just going to say it's a very difficult disorder to deal with within a family unit because it's it's an actual disease, but there's a component to it that's very personal in the sense that the the part of the disease is that it involves hurting people that you care about. And on one level, you can recognize that this is not within their control, right? Because that's the whole point. It's gotten out of
But it
control.
feels very personal.
And it feels very personal, and at the same time, like, what you experience on the other end of it is still valid.
Mhm.
Whether they did it on purpose or not, you still experienced, the results of that
The
path.
lying and the betrayal and the,
Mhm.
you know, the co addiction is a disease, it's a sickness just like a physical illness, but it's much worse in a lot of ways because it affects all of your relationships in a negative way.
Right.
And
Exactly.
and it doesn't take much to get to that point either. He for a long time, he
No.
was trying to manage everything, but it was very apparent, looking back, the first thing that started to suffer was his relationship with us because he shut
Mhm.
his walls went up and he shut down and he stopped doing stuff with us and he stopped paying attention and he stopped, you know. Now, that next morning, I didn't go with you guys to take him to
Yes.
detox. You just took him alone.
I don't remember. Yeah, I don't remember if you had
I was tired and I think I just
school
slept in. I think I was just tired and
or just that you were just like, "I can't deal with this
yeah,
right
I think
now."
I just didn't.
It was one of the
When we
2.
got home that night before, I think I was just like, I'm just gonna sleep. You take him to detox in the morning, and
Mhm.
because I think I was exhausted and I just you know I didn't, after being at the hospital for 6 hours. I was like, I don't think I really need to go. you know.
Yeah. Well, I think too you're just trying to wrap your head around what's happening. As was I, but like I had a better understanding of it than you did. So yeah, we went to a different hospital. And I will forever be grateful um because this particular ER, the triage nurse was so incredibly kind, and they brought him back to a room right away, and they were so um just gentle and nurturing and kind to him. And again, this is a person that we loved, so being in a place where I felt like they were seeing him as a human versus just an intoxicated person, um like I that is something I'll never forget, and I still to this day am super grateful for that, because I do think that if we had gone to the hospital and there was a lot of judgment in that case, your dad might have walked out. You know what I mean? And so sometimes I think that like God played a role in that, because I know there were a lot of prayers during that time too of like he needs this help. Um because I do think if he had started to feel really judged or dismissed, that he because at that time when we got to the ER in the morning, he was in active withdrawal because he hadn't drank all night, and he hadn't drank since the conversation. And so it withdrawal is so incredibly uncomfortable and painful that
Imagine
that's all you can
your
focus
worst
on.
hangover times 10. It's
Well, and like it's a feeling of what I've heard from people is like a feeling of literally wanting to like crawl out of your
mhm.
skin and just not being able to. And so I'm so thankful that they were so kind and considerate, like everyone, the nurses, the triage nurse, the doctor, etc. And they started medicating him right away, which was appropriate because when we got there, um I remember he went to take the medication, which was Ativan, which is a benzodiazepine, which is what they treat alcohol withdrawal with. Um,
Essentially to taper your nervous
literally,
system back to regular. Um,
right, and literally, when he was taking the cup to drink with the pill, I mean, his hand was shaking so bad that he almost couldn't get like the water was like spilling everywhere.
mhm.
Um, And so it was, like, really difficult to see him like that because, again, we never I mean, he would have, like, little tremors and things like that, but he also, again, had his family has that, like, just a little bit of a tremor in their
S-
hands in
Yeah.
general. Like, that's a hereditary thing, and so, it's not like we didn't ever see his hand shake a little bit, but it was
It had nothing to do
also
with
something
alcohol
that he'd
before.
always done. Right, so to see him really in active withdrawal and, like, really see how incredibly bad this had gotten, I don't even it was just I didn't even know what to think about it or how to feel about it.
Well, and
Um,
he was a guy who, like, you know, we've talked about his kind of showing emotion and stuff. He was a guy who never cried, who never broke, who
mhm.
never really showed much weakness in general. Like, I don't,
He did to me a few times, but that was in private, and
but
again, we had
private and
a different
right
relationship.
in an
Yeah.
intimate, close relationship, with your spouse,
Mhm.
that's a different thing than just in jet. Like to me, I had never seen him. I think the first time I ever saw him cry was when my grandpa died. And that was like the one and only time that
Yeah.
I saw him cry. And it wasn't even really crying, it was like a couple tears. And
Yeah.
like he just, even when he was tired or
He was
cranky or, in a bad mood or like you know, exhausted or whatever, he was never a complainer. He was never the guy who showed weakness or uh, you know, broke down or struggled in any of those ways with pretty much anything, it felt like. And then to see him in this state where he was so incredibly broken down.
yeah, it was a very difficult thing to watch, and again, thankful that the detox, facility that this particular hospital preferred to refer to, which was a good detox facility, had an opening for him, which, again, super appreciative of that. We had to wait for a while, in the ER in the hospital, before they could transfer him over because, as we know now, working in the ER,
Needed to be medically
nothing ever
cleared,
moves fast.
all that. And
Well, it wasn't even that, just nothing ever moves fast, unless you're dying. If things are going really fast, then you should be worried.
yeah,
In your
that's always the,
especially if it's busy.
if you're in the emergency room and I've seen this a lot with, it's kind of funny, I've seen this a lot with especially patients who are like on the verge of cardiac arrest, or like their EKGs show something scary, or they're like in SVT where they need to be cardioverted or something. A lot of times those patients just come in with like, "Oh, my chest feels funny," or "Oh, I feel flutter in my chest." And then
Uh-huh.
we see something and everybody floods into the room and there's a million things happening. And it's like, I remember I had one guy once who said exactly that. He's like, I've never been to an ER where things were happening this fast before, and this is terrifying. And I'm like, yeah, and if things are moving really quickly here, it means that there's something seriously, seriously wrong, and we need to be on
Mhm,
top of
and
it.
especially if it's a busy
Right.
ER. I mean, it's if you have a slower ER, that's a different story. But, yeah, so we were waiting to get his bed. I remember I walked down to get down to, like, it was a university hospital, so, like, they had a campus and whatnot, and so I went down to go get us food, and get him, like, Gatorade and some of that stuff to kinda help balance some stuff out, and, yeah, it was so painful to see him shake so bad and just have, like, visible withdrawal symptoms, like, not just little withdrawal symptoms, like, heavy withdrawal
Did
symptoms.
they give him a banana bag?
Um, I don't remember.
It's just a common vitamin bag full of a IV drip with a bunch of vitamins in it that we
I
give in the ER because it's yellow,
Yeah.
so we call it a banana bag. But I was just curious.
Yeah. Well, and also because when you drink alcohol, you deplete. You're usually low on thiamine and folic acid and
A lot
a
of
couple, like, really
a lot of your
key.
B vitamins, and then like potassium, magnesium, all
Mhm.
that stuff.
Yeah, your electrolytes get really messed up. Actually, I do not think that they did. I think they, just were giving him the oral, medicine to help manage his symptoms, and then the detox he was going to was medically assisted, as in they
Mm,
continued to give medication, so I believe he got his, like, vitamin replenishment via just taking,
oral
pills,
vitamins.
um, yeah, at the detox facility. Um, it was very weird. Uh, I couldn't go with him,
Yeah,
because he was in the ER. They had to transport him by ambulance,
do cardiac
and
monitoring and all that stuff.
well, no, it wasn't even about that. It's kind of the protocol, right? If you're getting admitted and you're transferred to a different hospital or a different part of the hospital, and again, this was a university hospital, so they had
Well,
buildings
and
in multiple
he's getting
places.
admitted to a medical unit, so they have to be able to monitor him during the transport as well. So that's kind of the purpose of that.
Exactly. And because it's detox and it is a locked facility and there were very strict rules around visitation and all of that stuff, like I couldn't go with him, which was really difficult for me because I don't
You
know,
wanted to
like I
support
was
him.
always yeah, and we always I don't know, like yeah, I just had always been there when stuff was going on, and I had to leave the ER before, they arrived to transport him, and it just was really hard to leave him there, and it also was really difficult because they take your cell phone away. They take everything and lock it up. I mean, and the whole purpose of that is to solely have you focused on, um you meet with a psychiatrist, you meet with therapists, you are getting medicated, you're learning about different resources for alcohol
You're
issues.
learning about addiction in and of itself and alcohol dependence and all of that stuff because a lot of
Mhm.
people who end up in that position know nothing about what they're actually going through. Um, so
Exactly.
it's like
And I re
it's also interesting because people get really weird about that protocol in the ER when people come in for mental
Mhm.
health issues, including addiction and needing of detox and that sort of thing. We do take all of your belongings and we lock them up. Not that you won't get them back, obviously, but um, and then we put you in mental health scrubs so that you're identified as a mental health patient rather than a medical patient. Um,
and not f that other patients know
right,
this. This is just for
right,
staff.
but it tends to be a safety thing, and you know I wouldn't necessarily say that everybody needs that level of protection or that level of security or whatever, but it's a blanket because there are a lot of people who do need that if they're going to get any better.
Mhm.
And it's also a safety mechanism of because people who are not in their right minds will in psychosis or not in touch with reality will
Mhm.
try to run
They
away and they
can
can't
harm themselves.
yeah, or they can't take care of themselves and they could
They
harm
could
themselves or other people, and so it becomes a safety issue as well. So that's the reason for those protocols, but
yeah.
it's still a scary thing to go through because it feels like you're going to jail
Yeah.
almost.
It honestly did, and then obviously when we visited later, it literally kind of felt like a
Yeah.
jail. Um, but I just remember driving home, well, first of all, before I even left, so my wedding ring, I had it was a double band. I had it is it soldered together?
Mhm.
Is that the
Yeah,
word?
I think so.
I don't know why that sounds
You
weird.
had your engagement band and your
I
wedding
had
band um connected.
yes, because I didn't like them twisting around separately. So they were together as one, and because I had been, actively practicing as a nurse at this point for a couple of years. I would take my ring off to go to work because water would get caught in in the crevices, and then my finger would get like, you know,
Gross.
raw from that. Yeah. And so prior to that, I had worn my wedding ring the entire time we had been married. I never took it off, maybe to put lotion on once in a while, but I was so used to wearing it that I immediately could tell if it wasn't on, So like I didn't take it off. Well, because I had started to get in this habit of taking it off for work, and obviously I was working, a regular schedule, I was starting to not notice if I had it on or not, right? And I remember specifically, I wish I hadn't, um, putting it on when we went to the hospital because I don't know, I just felt like I wanted to have it on. And anytime I wash my hands, or use like hand sanitizer, I have to put lotion on. It's literally like nails on a chalkboard for me if I do not put lotion on after I wash my hands. That like dry feeling, I just can't stand it. And so there were a couple times that I took my ring off, put it in my lap, put the lotion on. But then I would remember that it was sitting there and I put it back on. And when I got home, I realized I didn't have my ring and I had lost it. And I'm pretty sure that it was that exact scenario. I think I took it off to put lotion on. When I got up to leave, it probably rolled on the floor somewhere. I to this day am pretty devastated about that. Because we designed that ring together. I mean, I designed it, but like we were, it was something that we did together. Um,
Yeah.
is
And it
special,
was
and
your wedding
obviously it
ring.
had it for a long time.
Yeah.
It was my wedding ring and my engagement ring. And I called the ER immediately when I realized that I didn't have it. They couldn't find it, of course, and it was gold, and obviously and it didn't have a diamond in it. It was a sapphire. Just a square sapphire or princess cut. But being where the hospital was and there being a decent, population of like homeless people or people, I mean,
It went
it
missing.
is
Something
something that,
happened to it.
yeah, it's something that somebody would totally grab and try to pawn it off, right? And so they couldn't find it. I think I called lost and found like several times over the course of the next couple weeks just to see if it popped up anywhere. Never did. I think at some point, like a few months later, I put like a post on Facebook and just asked everybody to share it on the hopes that maybe somebody would have maybe seen it in like a pawn shop, or because it was very distinct and very like unique. It wasn't like a traditional ring. And yeah, never found it to this day. And so that was sad for me that like here we are dealing with this issue, and he's sick and not doing well, and then on top of it, like I felt the need to put my ring on, and then because I was so distracted, I lost it. And
Well, and of course, it got
the other
much
thing I
worse, a few, however many months later when he was no longer with us. And it's like, just the
oh
timing
yeah,
of all of that is terrible.
it was awful. And then I remember driving home, and I remember listening to a song. It was called Stop Lying, or Stop Lying. And it so encompassed kind of like what I was feeling at the time in terms of just feeling sort of betrayed, and yeah, like, that this person that I, had loved dearly for a long time, was lying to me. To this day, when I hear that song, it reminds me of that drive back from the detox facility or from the hospital to our house. And then I also remember that was the time, because again, I needed support. Like, on one level, we weren't in a place where I was just going to tell anybody what was going on, because we were trying to figure it out on our own. And honestly, it you know, it was Erick's story to tell, and it wasn't anybody's business at that point. But me needing support also, and it's not like I'm going to talk to you about this in the extent that I needed to talk about it, because again, you're our child and you were, a teenager. So I did call uh my grandma, your great grandma, the one that we talk about a lot, because I was really close to her, and I remember having a conversation with her on the
Are
phone.
really close to her.
And I also,
Not
yeah,
was, are.
yeah, sorry. And we are really close to her. Just because I needed to talk to somebody about it. Because I was in this like level of disbelief, like I can't believe I'm going through this right now. Like I just can't believe that this is the thing that is happening. And I think for me it was also because of the fact that my sister was in active, like severe addiction at that point. And I had been very involved in helping get her kids into safe places, and one of them lived with us for a while. Um and I saw the ups and the downs and just the whole gamut of everything that happens in severe addiction. And I remember thinking and actually praying, like, I don't know if I can handle this. And I felt really bad feeling that way, but I was like, I don't know if I can do this. I don't know if I can handle, dealing with this situation where I'm confident that it's not going to be an easy path. And I'm confident that it's going to probably get worse before it gets better, because he did have that mentality of like, I can fix it myself. And any research, any alcohol treatment program or substance use treatment program will tell you that you cannot typically fix it on your own. It's a family issue. It's a dynamic. It involves relationships. It's all sorts of things. And so I just remember feeling really overwhelmed and like, I just don't know if I can handle this. And kind of like, what am I going to do? Because like I was generally the strong one, I was always strong, and I just was like, I really was, I just didn't even know like how to deal with it or process it.
Right.
And then it was really weird just leaving him there and like not being able to call him, not being able to text him, always we always talked, several times a day. We texted often, and so it was um obviously a little foreshadowing, I guess, or like, a little taste of what was to come. But it was weird not being able to just get a hold of him and be like, what's going on? And then you worry, like, is he okay? Is he feeling okay? Like, what's going through his head? So those are the things that really stood out for me around, taking him to the detox itself.
And then, after he was there for probably 4 or 5 days, just, you know,
Yeah, it was between 3 and 5. The minimum was 3. The maximum typically was 5, just because it wasn't a treatment facility. It literally was just a detox
just to make
facility,
sure that you
which
went through
gives
withdrawal in a safe manner, basically. But
to the point where the alcohol is out of your system
I have
physically.
no idea what I don't know, and I don't remember anything about that entire week other than the one day we went and visited him. Like I have
Yeah,
no remembrance of anything else that I did during that period other than I remember. I think it was after like 2 days or so we went to go see him just to see how he was doing, and
yeah,
like for like it was like an hour of visitation that we had with him, and that
yeah.
was a really
Can I stop you for a second? I'm so sorry, I have to pee again.
okay.
I know, I literally like so bad. I'll be right back. Sorry, I was gonna try to hold it, but I literally would have peed my pants, I think.
I'm gonna put that in the
um,
episode. I'm putting that part in.
I mean, that's fine. I mean, we gotta keep it real, right?
Yeah.
Um, so, yeah, you were saying that you don't really remember much about that week other than the day we went to visit him. The only thing I remember about that week outside of visiting him is just it being so strange to like, again, processing what just happened,
Right.
and then it being so strange that I literally couldn't get a hold of, I couldn't just talk to him, and I couldn't, and they, and again, this is privacy laws, so I couldn't just call and get information on how he was doing either,
Hmm.
because HIPAA laws. So, like, even though he's my husband, I don't have automatic permission to get an update on his medical condition. Not to mention that they typically, I think, in that type of environment, don't give that information out anyways, even if like the person's okay with it. So it just was so weird, having to like having no contact with him
Hmm.
because like literally talk to him a bazillion times a day.
So then we went to go visit him, and that was a very profound experience for me personally, I think, because he, well, again, it's like a prison, and I wasn't there when you dropped him off, so I was very unsure.
I didn't
And
I wasn't there either.
well,
I had not been because I was in the
oh yeah,
ER. So
right.
like this was the actual detox
So this
facility.
was kind of my first, both of our, I would say, first interactions with this sort of place. But yeah, we went in, and everything was locked, and we had to leave. We had to put our stuff in a locker outside of the unit, our phones, our wallet, our
And it was for
keys.
safety to not be sneaking something in
Hmm.
for the person that's there or other people. The phones were protection because of patient
Yep.
privacy. I mean, yeah, so you have to lock everything up.
And we go in, and we sit down at a table, and he comes out, and I don't think he looked so terrible. Like, he looked sickly. He was shaking. He was in a orange, orange scrubs, mental health scrubs. Um, and he just looked so beaten down in general.
Yeah, I was gonna say the same thing as that
You could tell
it
he
was so
was
hard
in
to see him
really
like
rough
that.
shape, and he was still.
Mhm.
I mean, his hands were shaking. I think he was trying to control it too, because he didn't. I could tell
Mhm.
that he didn't want us to see him in that state, and he was trying so
Yeah.
hard to present himself as
Especially
though
you cuz
everything was okay. And yeah, I think for me
yeah.
especially, he didn't want me to see him that way. But like I said before, this was another one of those very profound moments for me where I realized like how serious all of this was, and how you know incredibly sad and messed up he was, and this the gravity of what he was going through. And I remember that made me.
And that it was Yeah, and that was literally it was gonna change our lives moving forward forever.
uh,
Again, not realizing that what was to come was gonna even change our lives even more, but, like,
and
nothing was gonna be the same after that.
it was so difficult to see him like that. It was very sad to see someone who I viewed as like my hero to be beaten down and broken like that. And I don't remember much about what we talked about or what we did in that conversation. It was only like an hour. It went by so fast. And then we left. And then I remember being extremely frustrated and angry with him because, again, naive 17-year
Mhm.
old didn't know anything about really addiction or any of, um, you know,
Let me stop you there too. It wasn't that you were naive, because you were not a naive teenager. It's just that you had not had exposure to this stuff
what I mean
before.
by saying naive is naive to this situation. I had never experienced
Yeah, I
anything like
guess.
this. I had
Fair.
zero understanding of alcohol addiction specifically, or I had a little bit of understanding of addiction dealing with your sister and like seeing you deal with that stuff, but like having it happen to my dad and having it be something like alcohol, which again, like in this moment, I had my own stigmas. now looking back, I realize how flawed my thinking was. But in that moment, my
Mhm.
only interaction with I remember leaving and saying, "Great, now I have an alcoholic dad." Like my dad's an
I
al
remember you saying
Yeah,
that as
we were
well.
walking through the parking garage, and I remember being so frustrated and angry, and like I remember thinking my dad was weak. I remember like kind of losing my respect for him in a lot of ways, you know, that he couldn't control himself around alcohol and like all of these things. And I remember, yeah, I remember. I mean, my only interaction with what was happening was what's portrayed in the media, which is like the drunk father who's a deadbeat, or like the angry, abusive kind of stuff. And I knew that wasn't my dad, but he obviously had this issue, and my perception of it was that he was weak, and that was not right.
Yeah, and
But in the moment,
I think
you know,
I was gonna say, I think also just the in addition to your own bias and stigmas, it's also being very consciously aware of the fact that like other people were gonna judge him as
well,
well. And we did care about
that was the other thing, is
him.
it's like, yeah, now I have to deal with other people's stigma as well. And I have
Mhm.
to, and my dad is going to have to deal with that. And like, but I do remember being very much in this mode of like, great, my dad's an alcoholic, we're that family now,
Mhm.
you know. And looking back, I think that's, I felt that way for, um again, because I lacked understanding of what was really going on. But I really do regret feeling that way, which is a weird thing to say because like
You can't
you can't
control how you
exactly.
feel.
But I
Mhm.
wish I didn't view that situation the way that I did in that moment.
Yeah. I remember very specifically, I think while he was at detox, you had a moment kind of around the same topic, where you were laying on the floor. Uh, we had like a landing in between all the bedrooms and the bathroom upstairs, and you were just laying there, and you just kept saying, you know, now something along the lines of like, now have a messed up family, and now I have, again, like the alcoholic dad, and you know we've worked so hard to not have this type of thing, and you were angry with your dad around like how could he do this to
I had
and I do
suddenly kind of found myself in the position where I no longer was normal. I
yeah,
was
yeah,
It was that moment of, you know, I immediately felt like an yeah,
shame.
yeah. I think that's
Hmm.
a good way of putting it. I immediately felt
And I think,
like I was now somebody who was different than everyone else.
yeah, and then also just like, I think sometimes, talking about the shame piece of it, and this kind of comes back to, I think, why you and I wanna wanted to do this podcast and really talk so in depth about this subject openly, is because there is a lot of shame that comes with it. And it's not just the shame of the person who is dealing with the situation or dealing with the illness, but it's shame for everyone that's involved because of the fact that we have such a stigma around substance use disorder and alcohol disorder and um those mental health in general. And so there's such a huge stigma that like it almost makes you feel like there must be something wrong with us if this person in our family is struggling with this like
Mhm.
horrible thing, right? Because it feels like a moral failing, and that's something that our country has perpetuated, our society has perpetuated, that, you got the war on drugs, you've got all this propaganda, and it's all about, um, there's just no compassion for people who are in that situation at this point. There is all of this medical research now that proves that this is a disorder, it's a disease, that it is it's a brain disease, and yet there's so much stigma wrapped around it, and there's so much bias,
And the idea
and people
the
that
idea that it's
just don't
the
understand.
idea that it's your choice. It was your choice to get into this
Mhm.
position. It was your choice to drink the alcohol. It was your choice to take whatever drug.
Which
It was,
is asinine.
yeah. And well,
It's asinine.
I mean, first of all, you know, he wasn't an addict for the entire up until 6 months.
For, like, 19
Yeah,
years.
he drank alcohol and he, just normally like everybody else, never had, didn't really have an issue with it until all of a sudden things got too difficult for him to cope healthily, or he was lacking
It was a
healthy
perfect
coping mechanisms.
storm of
Right,
things.
and then suddenly, oh, this thing that I is familiar to me also seems to help me with my problems. Um, and that's
Yeah.
how that slowly slipped into taking place. But there is this perception of, well, you never had to take a drink in the first place, and if you didn't, you wouldn't be the thing is when it comes to addiction, or it can be anything. That disease of addiction can be literally any. Haven't you ever seen the TLC, like, My Strange Addiction thing? Like, it's more common
Mhm.
with certain substances because they do hijack your pleasure centers, and they, on a chemical level, make you feel better. But, like, there are
Mhm.
people who are addicted to video games the same way that you can be addicted to drugs.
Mhm.
There are people who are addicted to sex and
Gambling.
gambling and all of those things in the same way,
Mhm.
and yet sometimes those things don't have the same stigma because, um, even though they still have the same impact on your relationships and your life and your mental state as everything
Exactly.
else. But it could be anything. It's just addiction
Mhm.
stems from not coping with something in your life in a healthy manner, in a productive manner. And the inability of
Yeah.
cope leads you to do things that make you feel better, even if they're destructive in the long term. And they make you feel better in the short term.
And
And
yeah. And there's higher risk also if you have genetics that play into that too.
mhm,
So if you have a family history of it, you're more susceptible to falling into that, especially if you don't have good coping mechanisms. And I think, that's why I said it's asinine around people sort of having this attitude around like, well, they made the choice to have the first drink. That, when people talk about, you know, um, drug addiction and alcoholism as like, yeah, maybe it's a disease, whatever, but like they still made the choice to have the first drink, or they still made the choice to take the first pill or do all those things. And when I say like that's absolutely asinine, it's because literally majority of people in this world have tried some sort of substance at one point in their life, including alcohol.
especially alcohol.
Like we just said, alcohol is part of our culture. It's a social thing that we
It's literally
do.
the most
So,
common drug in the entire world, besides caffeine.
besides caffeine and
Yeah.
nicotine, and like, um, and and then, even opioid addiction, a good chunk of people who become addicted to opioids, it starts with a prescription because they have legitimate physical pain. And
hmm
then it transitions into them using it to cope with their emotional pain.
hmm
And so it's so, ignorant to sort of go back to this blame game of there's something wrong with you because you chose to have the first drink or you chose to do this first, and we all choose to do that on
It's
some
not
level.
it's not the
The
substance
difference
that's the
is
issue. That's the biggest thing.
right, and Yeah. And the difference is that it could have been you. Nobody knows until you start doing it, like, you don't know if you're gonna have a trouble with alcohol unless you drink alcohol. You don't know that you're gonna be addicted to painkillers unless you start taking painkillers. So, like, people don't start out with this intention of, like, "I wanna ruin my life."
Right.
That's why it's a disease. That's why it's called addiction, that's why it gets out of
Well,
control.
and it always starts with, I like the way you put it. It usually starts with a very normal and acceptable way of getting into it, of like,
Mhm.
you have a drink, you turn 21 and you have drinks with friends, or you're in college for a lot of cases, and they binge drink, or they um because that's the culture. But it
Mhm.
or like you said with the opioid prescription, it's, they need it for a physical ailment, and then it transitions into, this also seems to help my emotional pain. It makes me feel better. Um,
Mhm.
and that's the ultimate crux of addiction, is it starts out as with good intentions of, this makes me feel better. This makes my mental pain feel better. Um,
Mhm.
and then it snowballs, and eventually it's not like an overnight thing. Nobody who's ever tried any drug is immediately addicted to it, ever.
Yeah.
Otherwise
It's a myth.
anybody who goes to the
That's a myth.
hospital and gets dilaudid because they broke their leg
Mhm.
would be immediately addicted
Mhm.
to heroin, because it's the same thing. Like,
Yeah.
it's a slow progression of using using whatever you're using, whatever you end up addicted to. It starts out as using it to cope with something that's going on in your life,
Exactly.
and then it snowballs from there and becomes
Exactly.
that disease. And so it can happen to anybody if they don't have solid coping mechanisms, because they start using
And I
negative ones.
Yeah. And I think it just comes back to, like, that shame piece and the guilt, and this is where the stigma comes in, and, I mean, you and I even felt it, like, after your dad died, the thing that we had suspicions about was the fact that there might be alcohol involved, and especially because there was alcohol in his room. And obviously, we still didn't know at this point, right? We're just doing some backstory, right, to give context to what led up to this. But, like, there was a level of shame and embarrassment that comes with, like, well, also protection. Like we said before, very protective. We didn't want the gossip mill to be going around Eric about something that he was privately dealing with, if that wasn't the thing that contributed to his death, because we didn't want him to be remembered that
Right.
way. Um, and it comes back to the fact that there is just this huge stigma, and it all comes down to, like, shame and embarrassment, and the mentality and the attitude that there's a moral failing with a person who struggles with this disorder, and that's just not true.
Well, and again, hindsight being 2020, and like knowing what we know now, both being in the medical field, both having dealt with this a lot more in our lives, both having gone through you know this situation in general, now have a much deeper understanding of all these things, which again is part of the reason why we wanted to do the podcast, is to bring to light some of these issues. But
Mhm.
when this was all going down, like, I had no prior knowledge, so I had my own stigmas. You, even though you had dealt with a lot of it in the past, like, I'm sure you still had your biases and stigmas about what was going on as well. And
I think for me, it wasn't even bias and stigmas, it was, I dealt with this stuff with my family, and I saw how devastating it was, and I just never in a million years thought that I would be in a position of having to deal with that in my own
right,
family.
right, in your immediate family. And so
Mhm.
then, we get he finally gets released from detox. Um, and I remember, and I think we can get into this in the next episode, but there was a solid, I mean, from the time he got released from detox, which was in December, he was sober and trying really hard to get
Mhm.
better, um, up until
Mhm.
he obviously very suddenly and randomly died. And again, we had no idea what it was. He was sober up until his death, and he you had that conversation with him about after detox is the first step. So then afterwards, it was
Mhm.
the next steps of trying to get him better, trying to keep him sober, therapy, medications, trying to get his depression under control, trying to get him healthy coping mechanisms so that he's not feeling the need to turn to alcohol, still trying to deal with the habit of alcohol. So we had to get rid of everything in the house
Mhm.
because at that point,
Mhm.
even beyond addiction, it's just a habit. And habits themselves are hard to
Mhm.
break, let alone an addiction where, they say a habit takes 21 days to break, which is extremely difficult for many people to break just a
Yeah, and
general habit.
I know yeah, I know everyone has kind of their own personal opinions about this, but I just didn't feel like it was helpful to have the very thing that he was struggling with in the house. It didn't mean that I stopped drinking alcohol. I mean, I definitely to this day I don't drink as much alcohol as I did before, and I didn't even drink a lot of alcohol before. I was just more of a social drinker, but like um the experience was so, I guess, traumatizing,
Well,
in a
and
way that, like, I didn't even have a desire for alcohol, so I didn't feel like it was fair to keep it around and just, like, shove it in his face,
well,
like, "Here it
and
is," you know
also
what I
like
mean?
we're as a family trying to support him in being sober so that he can get better and not be in this state. And having the temptation, they say the easiest way to stop eating junk food is to not have it in your house, right? It's the same thing with alcohol. It's like he's trying not to drink, he's trying to be sober, so why would we keep it readily accessible to him? And so, there's all these things that kind of went into the next few months of our lives of trying to make things better and trying to heal his mind and provide him healthy coping mechanisms and get him back to the Eric that we knew. And ultimately, he was making a ton of progress. He was getting
Yeah.
so much better, and I think we'll talk about that in the next episode.
Yeah, I think so, and then one thing I think that I'd love to cover, I mean, which we can maybe just touch on briefly, I think it might be a good way to end. Um, you have mentioned this before, I've seen this, with people around us and not like our inner circle close friend. Well,
Even some of them.
the ride or dies that we have, but some of our good friends, I mean, they there's a lot of people that have opinions, and personally I think it's kind of invasive and it's a little bit inappropriate to make those judgments and those assumptions. But I mean, how many times do you get asked about or commented on around your own drinking of alcohol because of all of this?
Yeah, I especially it took a long time for us to really talk about with anybody close to us even of what was going on behind the scenes until way later. But once I got comfortable with sharing the story in general,
Mhm.
a lot of people obviously were curious because it's not very often you hear an 18-year-old who just lost their dad. Like, so I would meet new people and everyone's naturally curious. And I became more used to that and more comfortable with it because it's like, yeah, it's a thing that happened. And it has affected my life. And again, I'm of the mentality that being open and honest about that stuff gives people more perspective, hence the podcast in general. But
Mhm.
a question I would always
Mhm.
get is, so, you,
And to this day, you still get this
yeah, like
question.
you must not drink alcohol, or do you drink alcohol because of that? And I don't drink a lot. I drink maybe socially. It's not very often, or like after, sometimes after work, come home and unwind with a beer or something like that. But like very rarely do I drink outside of social situations. Um, But it's always an interesting question because, people assume that because you've had this experience that you're sworn off of alcohol and that it's like this terrible thing. And the important thing to remember is, for me, and what I always would say is, I don't have an issue with alcohol like he did. And actually, because of that situation, I'm probably a lot more self-aware of my drinking habits than most people are. He would
Mhm.
drink because he's socially anxious, and then he would drink because to help with his anxiety or his depression and whatever. And I when I'm in those modes of like feeling anxious, or I almost purposefully avoid alcohol because I don't want to go down that path of using it as a coping mechanism.
Mhm.
Um and s-
Well, and I think people have opinions too because of I mean, there are some genetic components to it. So it's like, well, your dad had it. So like, do you but I think it's the way people approach
well,
it.
and I've
It's not even just like curiosity. It's like a statement of
I've
judgment
even
that
had
comes with
people
it.
who directly tell me, like, you need to be more careful with alcohol because your dad was had this issue. And it's like, you
Right.
don't think I
Super rude.
know that. First of all, yeah, that's rude, but also you don't think that I know that. Like, however,
Mhm.
again, the difference is when, especially when he was in full blown addiction, but he had an unhealthy relationship with alcohol. He was using it as a coping mechanism. He, used it as a tool to calm his mind. And,
Mhm.
that's, I'm very attuned to the reasons why I drink it, if and when I do drink. Um, and ultimately, that's not really anybody else's business anyway. So,
No.
um, I think people are naturally curious, and that's fine. Um, but
Yeah. And I do think
the assumption that because he had an issue, I'm automatically going to have an issue with it was
Mhm.
always a bit patronizing to me, because it's like, I'm not I'm not my father. I have a very
Mhm.
strong and high understanding now of what he was going through and what led to that, and it actually probably makes me more cautious around those things than most people are.
Mhm. And again, I think we've touched on a lot uh and it's kind of redundant at this point, but alcohol is the byproduct. Drugs are the byproduct. Sex addiction is the byproduct. Gambling is the byproduct. Any addiction, shopping addiction, it's a byproduct. It's not what you're addicted to that's the problem. It's what is underneath that is driving the addiction. And so, I think one of the things that especially for me growing up in the environment I did and always being a person who was very focused on self-development and growth and keeping and continuing to nurture my emotional and mental wellness, right? Because of the disasters I saw growing up. Um I was also very cognizant. So even though your dad was very resistant to um anything having to do with mental health and trying to address that up until after he went to detox, um that was something that I really worked hard with you about from a very young age. And it was so much more important for me for you to have emotional intelligence, self-awareness, to understand your emotions, to articulate them, to be able to connect the dots, to understand you know why things happen the way that they happen and how to deal with them, and like what types of things are good to, are healthy coping mechanisms. Because this is way before I even the thing with your dad was even an issue. It was just in general growing up in an environment where nobody coped with anything healthy around me, so like not wanting to perpetuate that on my side. And so I do think that that works in your favor in the sense that you are very self-aware. You're you do constantly work on your emotional health, and you're not afraid to ask for help. You're not afraid to go to therapy if you need to. You're not even afraid to get on medication if you need to. Because you recognize the importance of having to actually manage that so that it doesn't become something that gets out of
And
control.
because of that, you know, I would say that not that I don't have my own, things that I struggle with from now and then, but because of that, I've gotten to a point where I don't need medication anymore. I've gotten to a point where,
Mhm.
I have healthy coping mechanisms and I am happy, uh, on my own. And, I don't struggle with anxiety like I used to. I don't have my bouts of depression like I used to. There's things that swing and ebb and flow, and that's just life. But I've learned how to deal with those things when they come up in an effective way that
Mhm.
minimize the damaging effects of those things, on my life. Um, and not to say I don't get anxious or don't get stressed out or don't have, seasonal depression once in a while or whatever. Because I think, especially in this day and age, most people struggle with those ebbs and flows of um,
Mhm.
emotional stress. But I've learned ways to deal with them in a healthy way to where they don't take over my life when they happen. And
Yeah.
um,
And I think that's that's also you've seen the consequence of what
oh
happens
yeah,
when you don't pay attention to that stuff.
yeah, I've seen firsthand what happens when you don't address your mental health. And so that's why I've become so passionate
Mhm.
about, even with my friends, like I've told friends before, when I notice multiple occasions, when I notice, especially with alcohol, but just in general, like behavior of, hey, you know and not in a judgmental way, but in a concerned way of, like, hey, this is something that I've noticed. I don't know if you notice it in yourself, but, like, you might want to think about, you know, I've noticed that maybe you drink a lot when you're stressed out, or I noticed that you drink a lot when you're super anxious, or, you do other things that are maybe not so great for you and a little more self-destructive. And then it opens up that dialogue. Like, I had a friend come to me at one point and talk about, you know, I kind of told him that, like, I know he had struggled with some mental health stuff in general and whatnot. Um, and he had come to me and said, like, "What do you notice about my stuff?" And we had an open conversation about, like, I noticed that sometimes when you get anxious, you reach for a drink before anything else, and that, not saying
Mhm.
that that in and of itself is always a bad thing, but when it becomes a pattern and a consistent habit, it can lead to a much
Yeah.
worse problem. So, like, and it's, again, no, it's not a judgment thing. It's just a point it out so that maybe you become more aware of it, and then you become more self-aware when it does start to become more of an issue, if it starts affecting your life or that sort of thing.
Yeah.
um
And I think the true definition of, when any habit crosses over into addiction is, the key characteristics of it is it's out of control. You can't control it. Um and that it is having a negative impact on your life. So whether it be your personal relationships, your finances, your work, whatever, but it's literally causing negative things to happen in your life. That's when it becomes a problem, So if it's not affecting your life in a negative way, and you have to be honest with yourself, you have to be self-aware. You can't just pretend like you're fine and expect that to be an accurate assessment. But like if you really take inventory and go, yeah, I don't really treat people very well if I take XYZ or I drink this much, or I've missed a lot of work because I'm hungover, or um, I have a habit of like binge drinking on the weekends, partying and uh maybe
I don't
that
drink very often, but when I do, I drink a lot to where I black out and I don't know what I'm doing. And,
exactly.
all of those.
Mhm.
And that doesn't just stand for alcohol, that stands for
It's
anything.
anything, yeah.
you know Helping people become more self-aware in those aspects. I think it's very important, if you when you learn how to cope properly and you learn how to manage your mental health in an effective way. One of the first things, especially like in therapy and stuff, the part of the point of therapy is to help you self-analyze. Because a lot of
Mhm.
people don't really know how to do that in an effective way or are not honest with themselves. So, like, therapy
Mhm.
oftentimes functions as a mirror where you start talking about your problems, and the therapist can say, well, have you thought about it like this? Or why do you think you do that? Or why do you think that, your first inclination is when you're in that situation is to reach for alcohol or do whatever you do? And it serves as a
Mhm.
point of self analyzation. And once you understand yourself and why you do certain things, then you can start to mitigate or change those behaviors. But oftentimes people don't even realize that they're doing it until it's too late. And I think that was the case with
Yeah.
my dad. Is he didn't even
Mhm.
realize his
No.
behavior was potentially problematic or affecting his life until everything blew up all at
It
once.
was and until it was too late. And I think that's, the it's just the important thing to remember, that like it it can blow up, and I totally lost my thought.
I think it's important to remember that we're all human and we're all imperfect. And, you know, especially in the society we live in or just in daily life, whatever, it's very easy to fall into those patterns for anybody, literally anybody. To fall into
Yeah.
those unhealthy patterns or to you know do self-destructive behaviors or whatever. And oftentimes we don't understand ourselves well enough to pinpoint why we're doing it. And so the more,
Yeah.
and again, this is part of the whole reason why at least I'm so passionate about mental health and like understanding yourself, is so that you can do that self-analyzation of, and then you can benefit yourself because of it. You can make your life better
Mhm.
because of it, because once you understand yourself, you can start to make changes uh that are a lot healthier for you and will ultimately in the long run
Yeah.
lead to longevity and to a better life, more successful life. But you can't get there unless you
Yeah.
know yourself well.
Yeah, and I think that's another, I mean, it's just, I also have been very passionate about mental health. I think that's why you and I were really felt a strong urge to do this podcast. It I've been affected by mental health issues my entire life. Not, I mean, obviously my own, as a result of these things that have happened, and a few other things, but like just even growing up in an environment where everyone around me suffered with some sort of mental health issue. And so I've always been super passionate about it as well for those reasons, in that I do think not talking openly about it, um and the stigmas that happen, it really isn't helping anybody. It, like, all it does is further isolate people,
Mm.
and make them feel less than, which doesn't fix the problem, and it certainly doesn't make anyone want to, try to get help. And I think the other important thing to remember is, like, when we're saying, we try to practice, or like you're focused on like healthy coping mechanisms and I try to practice healthy coping mechanisms, by no means is that easy. It is not an easy thing to move through your pain and address uncomfortable emotions head on, whether it be anxiety, depression,
Oh no.
shame, guilt, anger, etc. So, we don't say healthy coping mechanisms flippantly. It's a difficult thing to do, to practice self-awareness, to ask yourself the hard questions, to choose to face maybe the things that are not so healthy about yourself and
it's
make those
it's a
changes.
scary
It's a
thing.
lifelong
It's a scary thing to address, the demons you have inside of you, because and
Mhm.
oftentimes that's why many people become very judgmental of others, because they don't want to fix their own issues. They don't want to look at themselves, so they
Yeah.
project onto others rather than looking at a mirror and trying to fix whatever they have going on. But it's a
And
terrifying
it's
thing to face to look at yourself in a mirror and notice all of the imperfections and have to face them head on, because it's uncomfortable. And
Mhm.
there's all of these feelings of guilt and shame and fear of the unknown. And even again, in my dad's case, like, part of the addiction brain and part of his issue with being resistant to a lot of things is, I don't know how to cope without alcohol. It's the only thing that I know how to do. It's the only
Yeah.
thing that makes me feel better. And so how am I supposed to face life without the one thing that allows me
Mhm.
to do that? And that's obviously a flawed way of thinking. But in that moment and in his position, everything else is unknown. It's staring into the void and saying, and trying to take that first step of, I have no idea where I'm going.
Yeah, it's either that, it's the fear of unknown, and, again, like we said with your dad, he had no reference point to understand that being on medications or going to therapy would help him feel better, right? And so, it is hard work to maintain healthy, um, coping mechanisms, healthy emotional state. It's not an easy thing to do. It requires ongoing effort. Like, you constantly are working on it. It's not something that you just fix and it's like, okay. And it is easier. It's so much easier to just pick up something and have an immediate instant gratification of it just making you feel better. Unfortunately, the healthy way of dealing with things that ultimately benefit you in the long run sometimes are painful in the short period
Mhm.
or very, very
I,
uncomfortable.
I think I think
So, we don't say healthy coping mechanisms lightly, because we also, I mean, I to this day am still struggling with things and I have to actively work on it every day.
I think that's one other. I mean, me too, obviously, but I think that's one other interesting point, is that it's especially when it comes to addiction and that sort of thing. But generally, and most people do this. People reach for instant gratification because it feels good in the now,
Mhm.
and they often are short-sighted and don't think about how it will affect them in the future. And that's what makes healthy coping mechanisms and dealing with your mental health and all that stuff, and dealing with your past traumas and actually addressing and processing them so difficult, is because on one hand you have instant gratification, things that will make me feel better right now but ultimately won't
Mhm.
benefit me in the long run, versus things that are going to be really
And could actually Right. And could actually make things
right,
worse.
but right now it feels good, versus
Mhm.
things that are difficult, things that are painful and hard to deal with, and and a scary thing to face right now. But if I do that difficult thing in the long term, my life is going to be better. Majority of people would rather feel comfortable now and deal with the rest later, because they don't think about the future and how it'll affect them in the long run. And I think that's just human nature at this point. It's not,
Yeah.
it's a very difficult thing
Well,
to
it's
overcome.
it's a societal thing too. I
Oh
mean, we
yeah.
live in a country where everything is at your fingertips, and that crosses over into, this type of thing as well.
So
So I think, yeah.
let's next episode we'll talk about what that process looked like for my dad post detox. That was the very
Mhm.
first step. Now he was in this point of trying to navigate all of those things that we just talked about, trying to figure out healthy coping
Yeah.
mechanisms, trying to, get on medications to control his anxiety so that he could function in daily life, trying to learn about himself and become more self aware and become more attuned to his behavior and to his inner mental health and to his inner self, and to potentially deal with a lot of the trauma that he likely had as a child and into an adult, and all of the things that were weighing on his mind, what that looked like post detox, post addiction.
Mhm.
So yeah,
Yeah.
s-
So until next
stay
time.
tuned.
Hey, you know how this works.
If you like this episode or just like us in general, you can find us at It's Going Podcast on all the things.
Don't forget to check out the links in the description.
And thanks for hanging out with us.